Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on our Facebook Live, our first one of 2024. We're really excited to see all of you here today. We are going to be doing Facebook Lives monthly on the last Tuesday of every month. So we'll have new speakers each month. We're really excited to kick this series off with Sherri Maxman from the College Maven today. I'm going to turn it over to her here in just a minute, but we are very excited to have you all on. We are trying a new time tonight, so feel free to leave comments about how this time works for you, how it doesn't, just so that we can kind of figure out what works best for everybody. Also in the comments, feel free to leave any questions, thoughts, concerns that you have. As we are doing this Facebook Live today, we will have some time at the end for questions and answers as always. And then a couple other housekeeping items. This is being recorded, so if you aren't catching us live, you can see this later on. It will be on our Facebook and our YouTube pages, and if you make comments after the live as well, we will be sure to try and come on and answer those for you. So that's my housekeeping items for this. So today, in our first Facebook Live of the year, we are kicking off with Sherri Maxman, who is an independent educational consultant that specializes in working with kids or students with learning disabilities. She's got a presentation that she's going to talk about today about the top 10 things to know when applying to college with a learning disability. So really excited to kind of see what that looks like, what those top tips are, especially as we are kind of getting into that season, whether you're a junior or senior or sophomore in some cases. It kind of depends. But I'm going to turn it over to Sherri now, let her talk a little bit about what she does at College Maven, and then she'll get started. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Samantha. It's great to be here. I'm very excited to be here with the NVLD project on Facebook Live. So as Samantha said, my name is Sherri Maxman. I'm based in New York City, and I'm an independent educational consultant, which is a fancy way of saying I'm a college counselor, not affiliated with a high school, but I work with families who just want more support throughout the college application process. And most of those families are families of a child with some sort of learning disability, including NVLD, ADHD, dyslexia, ASD, really pretty much anything. So the presentation that I'm about to give is one that I've given many, many times over the last 12 years. The form hasn't really changed very much, and most of the information is the same. I really enjoy giving this presentation. It really, I feel, includes everything, truly everything that a parent needs to know when they have a child who has a learning disability who's applying to college. So I'm going to go through these slides and these top 10 things really quickly, and I talk fast, but we'll have lots of time at the end for questions. I love questions. I will answer them to the best of my ability. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen, start my slide presentation, and we will go from there. So there we go. So this, as it says, is the top 10 things to know about applying to college with a learning disability. So, and they're in no particular order, by the way, for the most part. So the first one is standardized tests don't matter, or standardized tests matter until they don't. Now, this slide has probably changed the most in the past 12 years I've been giving this presentation, because the landscape of standardized tests, as we all know, has shifted an awful lot. I love this slide, by the way. I love the cartoon. It really illustrates how students of so many different backgrounds, abilities, whatever, are all asked to take the exact same test, and I just don't think it makes any sense. So I'll tell you what I tell families now. I can also tell you what I used to tell them, which is everybody should, take a test, an SAT or an ACT, and do some prep, because you may apply to a college that requires these tests. These days, as we all know, there are far, far fewer colleges that require these tests of students. So this, of course, changed with the pandemic. A lot of colleges said they were doing sort of 5-year pilot projects to see what was going to happen. So we're getting towards the end of that. We've heard of a couple of schools that are asking for test scores again, but by and large, these schools are making it optional. So what does that mean for your child? So if you have a child who really just doesn't do well on these standardized tests, I really think it's a family decision. And it's okay if your decision is not to have your child take the test. The colleges are telling us that they are truly test optional. They really want us to know that when they say they're test optional, they're not just assuming that a student has done poorly on the test. They really want us to know that. What we've seen anecdotally, to be honest with you, is some of the more selective schools, they like seeing the test scores. I'll just be honest with you. It can work in a student's favor if they do well on the tests. One thing I tell families is the grades are more important than the test scores. So if studying for the test takes away from a student's grades, that's a decision that you have to sort of wrestle with. Again, the grades are always going to be most important. So there is a list that you might have heard about called fairtest.org, and it tells you, I just actually updated this today, there's more than 2,000 colleges that are currently test optional or test flexible. So what I mean by test flexible or the next bullet point, which is test optional conditional, it means every now and then you'll come across a college that says, we don't require test scores, but if you're not submitting test scores, we are requiring an extra essay, an extra letter of recommendation, that sort of thing. But there aren't that many colleges like that. So most of the colleges out there now really are truly test optional. Again, this is a landscape that's constantly changing, so we have to keep an eye on this. And it's really a family decision. So really, as a family, you have to decide if it's worth prepping for it, taking the test. If your child is going to take the test, either an SAT or an ACT, I do recommend doing some prep just so that the student is comfortable with the test and can do their best on it. Now, documentation, on the other hand, usually matters very much, although this is also a bit of a shifting landscape, which we'll talk about. So what do I mean by documentation? That usually means that in order for a student to get accommodations in college, which again, we'll get to, they need to have documentation, meaning a neuropsychological or psychoeducational evaluation. Usually, an IEP or a 504 is not what the college is looking for. So they want that more extensive documentation, evaluation. A lot of colleges are going to ask for it to be recent, within the past 2 or 3 years, because they want to see the adult versions of the tests, which usually aren't given to students until they're 16. So that's one of the reasons why they want something recent. Definitely, there are colleges that have some wiggle room with that. Um, and if you want to know the exact documentation that's required, it's actually pretty simple. Most colleges have it right on their disability services websites. And how do you find that? It's not front and center. You go to a college's website, go to the search box and type in disability services. Sometimes it's called accessibility, but that's where you find the very specific documentation requirements, including the specific tests that they want to see. Now, the process of getting accommodations in college is very different than the process in high school. And that's a really important distinction to know. So part of what you need to know are the laws. And we could do a whole separate webinar on this, but just really quickly, K through 12 is governed by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which guarantees anyone with a disability a free and appropriate public education. And then you've heard of a 504. Your students might have a 504, and that's part of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's supposed to sort of level the playing field and prevent discrimination against students who have learning disabilities. And you've probably also heard of FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which protects the students' educational records. So what's important to know here is that those first two, so Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and the 504 section, those don't apply in college. So sometimes you hear about people taking their IEP to college or a 504 to college, but that's not how it works. So what happens in college, that's simply by the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it's really up to the colleges to decide which accommodations they're going to give students according to the student's documentation. So what are some commonly requested accommodations in college? You may be familiar with some of these, but not all of them. Extended time for exams, very common, as you probably know. Reduced distraction exam sites. Note takers, those are other students in the class who take notes, turn them into disability services, and then they're distributed to students who get them as an accommodation. I've been hearing that's less common because of technology. Now students mostly record classes or lectures, but there are still colleges that can have note takers. Readers or laptops for exams. And when I say readers, it's usually, an electronic reader. It's not, a human being who's sitting there reading a test to a student. A single dorm room. So this is an accommodation. It's a fairly common one. It is not always available, but it often is. And this can be good for a student who really just needs that quiet, or that needs that lack of distraction, needs a place to really unwind without anybody else around. Priority registration, I think, is another good one that a lot of that, for example, you don't get that in high school because there isn't the same type of registration. But that's good because the student can really choose the classes with the professors that best fits their learning style. If they really struggle with morning classes, they can register, they can have the first shot at registering for afternoon classes. So it's a really nice accommodation to have. Reduce course load. That's another great accommodation for some students. The transition from high school to college is really, really challenging. And I'll talk more about that. It's sort of a pet topic of mine. It's challenging for any student, but it can be really challenging for a student with any kind of learning challenge. So you can often get that as an accommodation in the first and maybe second semester. You don't usually have that for all 4 years. And oftentimes you have to maintain a certain course load to get things like financial aid and on-campus housing, but that can be a great accommodation to ask for. And professors' notes, which are what they say, they're professors' notes that they usually have before a class, but that's a little less common now again, partly actually because professors don't always have those, but also because of technology. Now, colleges are mandated to provide what they consider reasonable accommodations. So everything that I just mentioned, I can't think of why they wouldn't be considered reasonable accommodations, based on the student's documentation. But they can reject requests if they would do things like alter the nature of a course. So obviously in a language course, a student who struggles with language, they're still going to have to read and study and speak the language. And we'll talk about course substitutions in a little bit. Um, they can reject something that will create an undue financial administrative burden. And this could be something like hiring extra staff, or even for a physical disability, like building a new facility. And kind of writing onto that is they do not have to provide a personal service or an aid like any sort of assistant. They don't provide hearing aids. They don't provide specialized one-on-one tutoring other than the tutoring that they offer to all students. So here's another huge difference between high school and college. And this is really what it really boils down to in terms of the accommodations and the assistance that students get. Okay, so grades K through 12, it is the school's responsibility for identifying, testing, and providing services for students with learning disabilities. And if you have a student or child with a learning disability, you know this already. You know this already. That is kind of turned upside down in college. So in college, it is entirely up to the student to self-identify and to ask for or apply for accommodations. And those accommodations may not be the same as what the student received in high school. And in fact, foreign language is a great example, which again, we'll get to. So this is why it's very important for the student to be aware of what their challenges are, what their learning disability is, what their strengths are, and what they need in order to be successful. Some of the main differences between high school and college. This is a big one. Students spend 20 to 30 hours per week in class, so they're in school most of the day. Students are entitled by law to an education. Teachers do remind students frequently about assignments, about due days, about tests. They see the students every day. Course modifications are possible. So you may have a student who has had modified courses. Tests are more frequent and they cover smaller amounts of material. And the school day is structured, and that last one is a very important one. So you may remember a lot of this from when you were in school. So with this last one, school day is structured, I think a lot of parents don't really think about, or students think about, how incredibly structured life is in high school. It may not seem that way, but again, the student is in school the same amount of time each day, and pretty much their afternoon activities are planned out. I mean, everything is really planned out, which is completely opposite of what happens in college. So in college, students spend, and if you went to college, you'll remember this, much, much, much less time in the classroom, maybe 10 or 15 hours a week. And they usually don't have the same class every day, so they don't see the same professors every day, so the professors aren't always reminding them of what they need to do. The formula that I always hear is that for every hour that the student spends in the class, they need to expect to spend 3 hours outside the classroom on homework, on reading, on writing, on research, on working on projects. And that takes a lot of getting used to. So a student is in class only a couple of hours a day and they feel like they have all this free time, but it's not free time. They have a lot of work they're expected to do. The faculty expects the students to keep track of their assignments, of their exams, so they're given syllabus at the beginning of the semester, and that might be the only reminder that they get. So they've got to keep track of that. So they're going to have fewer tests. They may just have a midterm and a final. So obviously it's going to cover a much larger amount of material that also takes a lot of getting used to. Students must manage their own time, which can be a huge challenge for students with executive functioning challenges. And courses and curriculum are never modified. So if a student did have a modified curriculum or courses in high school, you need to know that that's not going to happen in college. This is a big one that families often ask about. Students don't have to identify themselves as learning disabled on their college applications, but in some cases it can help explain things about school records. So, again, admissions officers will tell us that the more they know about a student, the better. Okay? Having said that, what I would tell most families is if you feel that your child's academic records really reflect what their abilities are, there may be no reason to talk about any sort of learning challenge. Oftentimes, it's when grades are all over the place, which can be one of the hallmarks of a learning disability. That might be a good time to explain very briefly, why there are higher grades in some areas and, maybe lower grades in others. And there are a couple of different ways to go about doing this. So one of them could be the Common App essay. Now, when I first started doing this work and I was going to a lot of talks, learning more about this, one of the presenters that spoke said, a student should always write about their Common App, their learning disability and their Common App essay. It's a great topic. The next talk I went to, the person said, students should never write about their learning disabilities and their Common App essay. It's a terrible topic. When the truth is, there's no hard and set rules. Okay. But a couple of things. I will tell you that I've heard a couple of admissions officers say, oh, if I see another essay about ADHD. I mean, it could be a good topic. It's certainly not a unique topic. I will tell you that. Sometimes parents have seen so much progress that their students have made. They're so proud of their students. They feel like that's what they should write about in their Common App essay. But that's not what the student wants to write about. That's not their story. So if you have a child who is writing an essay and you feel that's a great topic, but they don't, let them be the one to make that decision. The other thing I'll say is I personally prefer to see an essay that's not just about a learning disability, but maybe the learning disability is part of it. And the example I give is a number of years ago, I worked with a student who wanted to study art, and she wrote her essay about the things that influenced her art. The fact that she was Asian, the fact that she was adopted, and the fact that she had a learning disability. So she couldn't read or write that well, so she ended up making up a lot of stories in her head and sort of drawing them in her head. And so that's what really inspired her art. I loved that because it was part of her story, not her only story or her whole story. You can also have the student's counselor mention a learning disability in their letter of recommendation, but they probably won't do that unless you talk to them about it first. Colleges cannot and will not ask any disability-related questions during the admissions process. The only time that they might is sometimes if you apply to a college and they have a fee-based academic support program, which I'll talk about, they may ask in the application, are you planning to apply here? And if you are, you should answer yes. And obviously, you're not going to be penalized for that. And there should be no indication on a student's transcript about any sort of learning disability. And SAT and ACT scores won't indicate that there were any sort of accommodations. That used to not be the case. So you might remember that from many years ago. But now there's absolutely no indication of a different testing site or time or whatever. So that's, if you don't want to reveal that, then that won't be revealed. It's critical for students to know what their learning challenges are, how to explain them, and what kind of support they need. So what you have to realize is that your student is going to be going away to college without you. And nobody at the college really wants to talk to the parents about the students. They want to talk to the student. When I visit a college, I always try to visit disability services to see, what's going on in their office, how they work with students, what their recent documentation requirements are, et cetera, et cetera. And an awful lot of those people who work there tell me that students come into their office and they say, I have a learning disability, but I don't know what it is, and I know I should get accommodations. If a student is going off to college, they really need to know what their strengths are and what their challenges are and how to ask for help. If they don't know, by the way, I've worked with a few students whose parents did not tell them they had a learning disability, which is a whole other story. And I said, well, you should tell them because when they go to college, their documentation is going to be right there for everybody to see. And they're going to find out there, and that's not the best way for them to find out. What I recommend, or what most professionals would recommend, is when your child has that evaluation, they need to sit down with the person who did the evaluation afterwards and go over it with them. And the person who did the evaluation, usually a neuropsychologist, this is part of what they do, is they talk students through the evaluation, using language they'll understand, using language that will make them feel good about themselves and realize, wow, I have all these strengths and I have some challenges, and this is why. It's not because I'm dumb or whatever, it's because my brain works differently. And this is what I need in order to do well in college. And that's a much better way to find out. I do not recommend parents do that with their students, even if you are a professional. It's much better done by a different professional without that emotional attachment to the child. And I just really like this cartoon. Student isn't disabled, perhaps the teacher is teaching disabled. The best way to find out about accommodations and support at a college is to call and ask or meet with in person with support staff on campus. And I do this all the time. I was actually visiting some colleges with a colleague a few weeks ago, and that's what I was doing. And sometimes I hear families say, "Oh, but if I call disability services, if I meet with disability services, they'll find out that my child has a learning disability and they won't accept them." Well, let me tell you something. You never have to worry about that. Cross that off your list. Because first of all, the colleges know they're getting students with learning disabilities. That's why they have an Office of Disability Services. They know they could be getting, depending on the size of the school, they're getting hundreds. This is nothing new to them whatsoever. Also, disability services is here, admissions is here. They have nothing to do with each other. They're way too busy to have anything to do with each other. It's probably illegal for disability services to talk to admissions about a student's learning disabilities. Again, the only time this may happen is when a student applies both to the learning support program and the college at the same time. You don't have to worry about it. I can promise you that. They know they're getting students with learning disabilities. That's not going to stop a student from being admitted. We're going to talk for a minute about the differences between accommodations and support services and different levels of support, but these are questions that are good to ask when you visit disability services on a college campus. So this is how it works in college. There's basically 3 different levels of support. Every college is going to have what I call basic services or accommodations. These are mandated by the ADA, as I mentioned earlier. It's part of the Americans with Disability Act. And these are administered by Disability Services, or sometimes it's called Accessibility Services or Accessibility Office. And their job, their purpose is to make sure that these accommodations are available to the students. They don't do executive functioning coaching. I mean, they might, but that's really not their job. And so that's a good thing to know about. For these accommodations, and we talked about those earlier, this is where the documentation requirement comes in. Now, it's possible that the college doesn't require the same level of documentation that other colleges do. You might be able to get away with an IEP, but this is a good question to ask when you contact disability services. Students have to request the services. So nobody is going to offer the student services. The students have to, if they need extended time on a test, works differently at each college, but they may have to hand a letter or contact a professor by email. Works a little differently at every college, but it is up to the students. Very important. And there's never a fee for these. There's never a fee for accommodations, ever. Then there's different names for it, but what I might call mid-level or coordinated services. These are also available in some form on every college campus, and this is what might be called academic support services or student success services, student academic success services. They're available to all students, no documentation required. Again, students have to go in and request these services, and they include things that you've probably heard about, peer tutoring, various workshops and everything from note taking to test taking to, reducing anxiety maybe. Most colleges will have a writing center and a math center to help students with those. It's administered again by, academic services, academic support services, student success. It's called something a little different on every campus, but every campus will have it. Then there's what I call a fee-based comprehensive academic support services. So they're available to pretty much all students who can or are willing to pay the fee. Documentation is not always required. Sometimes it is. Some programs do require it. Some do not. This is where it pays to, again, reach out and ask. The difference between this and a lot of the other services, academic support services, are these are always administered by learning specialists. So you won't find peer tutors, peer academic coaches, whatever. So this is always staffed by learning specialists, by people usually with master's degrees in special ed. People are highly qualified to work with students with all kinds of learning challenges. And the main hallmark of these programs is the one-on-one support that the students get from this learning specialist. It's not every day. It's not, hours every day, but it's at least a couple of hours a week, usually at least one. Oftentimes it's two, sometimes three. It can include professional tutoring, so not peer tutoring, but professional tutoring, and sometimes some academic oversight, which means that sometimes the professors will reach out to this department if they notice that a student is struggling. That's going to happen, as you can imagine, more at a smaller school than at a bigger school, and it's definitely not at every school, but it will be at some schools. Colleges will sometimes allow course substitutions, but waivers almost never. I actually don't ever use the word waiver when I talk to disability services. So this is important. If you have a child, particularly who struggles with foreign language, I work with a lot of students who struggle with foreign language. So many colleges will allow, for most colleges do require some sort of foreign language for students to graduate. Not all, but many of them. I'd say more than not. Oftentimes, if a student has appropriate documentation, you can get some sort of foreign language substitution. And it could be another English course or a culture course or whatever. It's different at every school. But I have come across a number of colleges that do not offer this as an accommodation. And they say, everybody who graduates from our college must take a semester, 2 semesters, 3 semesters of foreign language. No exceptions. Doesn't matter what happened in high school. Doesn't matter what the documentation says. Doesn't matter that the student has never taken a foreign language before. They are allowed by law to require that of their graduates. I think this is really important to find out before a student goes to a college, because if you have a student who really struggles and they get into a college that they love, but then they find out they have to take 2 or 3 semesters of foreign language that they really struggle with, to me, that's a real problem. So that I think is very important to find out ahead of time. Sometimes you can find it out on a college's website. It's a little difficult, or call disability services. That's the easier way. When it comes to math, I very rarely find a student who gets any sort of math substitution, but the thing with math is there's usually all different kinds of classes that you can take, like statistics, which sounds hard to me, but I guess is easier than some math. Usually there's like college math 101, so there's a lot more flexibility there for a student who struggles with math. But again, these are all good things to find out while you're investigating colleges. Self-advocacy is the most important skill students will need as they head off to college without our support. So again, I could do a whole separate, webinar just on this. So here's the thing, especially if you have a student who has learning challenges, you've been advocating for them since they're very little, and you're still advocating for them. And now people are going to tell you they're going to have to do it, including me. They're going to have to start doing it themselves. Well, that's not so easy. And there's no, official guidelines on how to do that. But it is something that needs to be done because, as you can see, they're going to have to ask for help themselves when they get to college. And they're going to have to do a lot of other things for themselves. So how do we do this? And what I tell parents is it's one step at a time. I tell parents to make a physical written list of all the things that they do for their children that they know their kids can do for themselves. And one by one, their students need to do them for themselves. Getting themselves up in the morning, making simple meals, one of my favorites is have students make their own doctor's or dentist appointments and go to them on their own. Teenagers certainly are ready to do that, and they'll have to do that once they're in college. I'm not saying just toss them out all at once, but one by one, start letting them do those things for themselves that they can do. Maybe they don't know they can do, but they need to know that. Something else that I'll tell you is, if you take nothing else away from this presentation, although I hope you take a lot, please don't ever, ever, ever tell your child that it's the best 4 years of their life. I think that's a terrible amount of pressure and expectation to put on your kids. College is hard. It's harder now than it used to be. The world is harder than it used to be. It's definitely hard. And then they're 22 and the best 4 years of their life are behind them. I think that's really depressing. So please don't tell them that. The other thing I want to say, and I feel very strongly about this, and I alluded to it earlier, is this is a really challenging transition for every student, which is another reason why you shouldn't, tell them that college is just fun. It's a hard transition for every student. And I tell the story of my younger daughter, who she went to college a long time ago at this point, but she did well in school. She had a lot of friends. I mean, she had every reason to go off to college and expect to be like a great success. And the day she left for college, she got dressed and she said to me, "Do I look like someone you'd want to be friends with?" Which is not something you would ever expect to hear from a kid like her. It's hard. And then months later, she said very casually, "Oh, I only cried a few times that first week." So she knows that I tell this story about her, but I think it just shows that it's a challenge for all students. And if there's a way to convey that to your child, that it's going to be challenging, that they should always reach out for help. When I have students I work with, when I'm done working with them, I make sure they know where they can reach out to help at school, their parents, they can contact me and I'll help them find help. Um, it's hard. And so we have to be there for them and know that if they struggle, it's really very common. It's almost to be expected. It's okay. And everybody will turn out okay, but it's challenging. And I just think that's something we all need to be really aware of. All right. Put those accommodations in place, even if your child insists they won't need them. And I hear this all the time from students. I don't have a learning disability anymore. I don't want to be different. I want to go to college and I want to do it on my own. And my response to that is, if you wear glasses, then you don't suddenly stop needing them. You still need your glasses. And again, college is harder. You need those accommodations, but we can't force them to use them. But what we can do as parents, and this is something that I want parents to do, don't leave it to your kid because it might not get done. Parents need to get this process going. As soon as you know where your kid's going to college, you pick up the phone, you call disability services, you say, "My child is starting college there in the fall. I believe they qualify for accommodations. How do we get that process started?" They'll get that process started, mostly with your student, maybe with you, but you want those accommodations in place the minute your child gets to college. Because even if they don't use them at first, there's a good chance that halfway through the semester, and I hear this all the time, they'll crash and burn and they'll realize, maybe I could really use those accommodations. But if they haven't registered with disability services and the paperwork's not in, then it could be a couple of weeks before they get their accommodations, and you don't want that. So again, this is like the last big thing that I really advise parents to do before letting their child take over. And really what all of this is about, and what we all want, is to set our children up for success. So when you have a child who has some of these challenges that maybe other students don't, it takes a few extra steps. It might take a little extra research when you're putting together their college list. You're trying to figure out where they can go to college. You're trying to figure out what kind of support they need. Really, what we want to do is make sure that when they get to college, again, it's not easy either at the beginning or really throughout. But there's no reason why they can't be set up for success as long as are realistic and, you put in place the things that they'll really need to be successful. So, I really hope you found this useful. I have contact information here. I'm going to take myself off the screen share in a moment. And if there are any questions, I'd be really happy to answer them.
Awesome, Sherri. And we'll also drop that contact information into the comments on the chat just so that everybody's got it kind of in writing. They can copy paste as well. So I, as always, took notes and have some kind of questions and comments. My first is number 8. I could talk forever as an ex-high school educator. I could talk forever about how unprepared high school students are going into college. And I luckily did not teach a testing core subject, so I was able to work on some of those skills with my students. But oh my gosh, I wish that there was a course for seniors. And again, I could talk about the curriculum for high school students across the board, but a course for seniors to teach you some of that stuff, because it is such a drastic life change and lifestyle, and everything is so different that I just wish that we did more as a U.S. education system to prepare students for that transition, because it is so easy to fall through the cracks. It is so easy to misstep that transition. And that, that first year of college, that determines a lot about the next 4 years, which are not always the greatest 4 years of your life. I love that you said that. That is so much pressure. And I do think, life gets better afterwards. I hope that studying 60 hours a week isn't the best years of our lives. But those are like my 2 favorite things that you said today that really struck me as someone who's been on the other end of this with the high school students and their end. So love
And,
that.
and I will, and one of the things, by the way, I think that make it more complicated for kids today, let's face it, is social media. Okay. Because their friends are posting, pictures of themselves, having a blast and going to, beer parties, doing all that stuff, but they're not sharing pictures or information about themselves with the
Yeah.
struggles.
Yeah.
And I remember it was a number of years ago. I think I was at Brandeis University, and when I visited college, I tried to sit in the cafeteria and talk to students. I asked them why they went to that school. And I remember I was talking to two girls and I said, what was it like when you first got here? And they were like, it was so hard. And one of them told me she had a brother who went to college somewhere else in Boston, an older brother, and she mentioned it to him, that she was struggling. And only then did he tell her how much he had struggled in the
Mhm.
beginning. So
Yeah.
this is not something people talk about. And I don't tell parents this to scare them, to freak them out, to tell them to expect the worst, but it's hard, and just know that if your child is struggling, you don't want them to feel bad, you just want to support them and say it's kind of, expected. Like you said, it is probably the biggest transition they've made in their life to date.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a question about number one, as well as a comment in our kind of chat section. So my question is, would you recommend, and you may have touched on this, I may have just missed it, would you recommend taking practice tests beforehand to get used to that? And would you recommend taking them at home or in an actual practice facility where it's
Mhm.
like a mock almost of the real exam? What would be your advice?
It's a great question. And actually, a woman I know wrote a book that you might have heard of. This is quite a few years ago now, called The Perfect Score. And she was inspired by her son who was studying for the SAT. So she decided she was going to study for the SAT, take each seating of it over the course of the year and see what kind of studying worked best. So it's a great book, but what really struck me was she felt, and I think there's a lot of truth to this, that the best preparation was taking practice tests, um, in the same, if you can't do it in the same setting, but, maybe just at your dining room table where it's quiet, but with the same timing and the same conditions as much as possible as the real tests. So a lot of it is getting used to the pace of the test. I know now the test has changed, so it's electronic, so I'm not really sure how that's going to happen. I think there'll be ways to take tests electronically, practice tests. But yes, I think getting used to it is definitely a big part of it. You want your child to be comfortable and as not as nervous as possible going into these tests. I do think that if you can get some tutoring for them, whether it's private, semi-private class, whatever, I think that that can also be helpful just in, again, maybe, learning some of the tricks of taking the test just to be as comfortable as possible. So yes, I think taking practice tests is a wonderful way to prepare.
Awesome. Yeah, because it's kind of an intimidating environment to walk into as well. It's very different than a final exam in high school, even.
Exactly.
You're going into this place you've probably never been to. Mine was at a convention center, I think. And you're walking in with students that aren't typically your classmates. So I think it's just that environment too, that change and getting used to that. So
It is. And by the way, the woman who wrote this book that I mentioned mentions that about the different settings and how it affected her. Like she said, in one, she was in a gymnasium, and on the other side of the wall, like the curtain, was the school band was practicing while the students were taking the SAT. So
I'm shocked at
I
that.
know, I
That's
know. So,
crazy.
so unfortunately, there are a lot of things that can affect the outcome of that test. Another reason why I'm not a fan, but again, that's a topic for another webinar.
A whole nother topic we could talk
A
about.
whole other topic.
So then we have a question in our comment section of if a student does poorly on the SAT or ACT, does the fact that they took the test mean that they have to report the scores to test optional schools?
Definitely not. It's entirely up to you. There's one college I can think of that are sort of notorious for this. Georgetown University, they require you to submit any and all test scores. Um, I just happen to know that. But no, it is entirely up to you. You've heard about schools that take different parts of the test. So the term is escaping me for the moment. and take the highest score. So what that means is that, let's say you take the SAT 3 times and you get, different scores each time, some higher, some lower. You can't pick out the highest of the English and the highest of the math. So what happens is you send in all your test scores and they take the high super score, just came to me, and they will super score for you.
Oh, wow.
But
That's
no,
awesome.
but no, if you take, let's say you take 2 different tests and you do much better on the first as a whole than on the second, then you just send the first and not the second.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Um, one is it's kind of just a comment. And if you have any kind of advice or if you've had parents that have run into this, but neuropsychs are expensive.
Yes, I know
If
they
you've
are.
gotten one,
In there.
yeah, if you've gotten one as a middle schooler and you need to get a new one, do you have, I mean, is there any advice? Is there anything you can recommend? Just because they've likely had one in elementary, they may have had a new one in middle school. Would you recommend not getting? Would you recommend waiting if you can, would you skip a middle school one if there's a difference? Or like what have parents kind of encountered with that requirement or
Well, as with many things with this entire college application process, it depends. And that was sort of the joke at a conference a few years ago, is like the whole theme of the conference was it depends.
yeah.
So here's what complicates this a little bit is, colleges, while many of them still want to see that, neuropsych from, 10th or maybe 11th grade or the adult versions of the tests, some colleges have some wiggle room. The problem is the only way that I have figured out to find out is to call and ask. For example, I visited, it just happened to be Rollins College, which is in Florida, a few years ago. And I met with disability services and I said, what are your documentation requirements? And they're like, oh, we don't have any. I was like, you don't? They said, no, we just sit with the student. We find out, what supports they had, in high school, and we put those in place. I was like, wow, that's amazing. So that exists out there, but the problem is there's no clearinghouse of information. Even I don't, can't keep total track of that, of what colleges do require updated documentation, where there's wiggle room, some don't have wiggle room. I think if your child needs a neuropsych in middle school, you have to get it because that's a long way to college. So there's a lot that happens. And, if they need the accommodation support, whatever, in middle school going into high school, and they need the neuropsych, it's also a good way for you to see where the student is, mentally, emotionally, academically. You got to get that. Now, in terms of maybe lower cost evaluations, there's no clearinghouse of this, but what I would say is start early, asking around. Ask your pediatrician, ask other psychologists, ask other parents. There are places where you can get lower cost neuropsychs. A lot of times you can get them at a university that has a PhD program in psychology, and they have, you know, doctorate candidates do them with a lot of supervision. So that's one thing you can try calling a local university. But again, there's no one place, but you have to ask around, you have to do a little bit of digging. Believe me, I know how expensive they are. You can also, it's possible if you go to another town or even another state, that's been done. They might be less expensive. For example, in New York City, $7,000, $8,000. But I can tell you, if you go to a different nearby state, you could get them for less.
Yeah, cool. And then just one of the things that you were talking about with the differences between high school and college, as far as accommodations, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but because NVLD is not in the DSM, it is not technically recognized in high school. So your student may be their IEP and not 401k, 504 plan. The IEP and 504 may be based on, say, comorbid conditions or differences. College, because it is not relying on the DSM to recognize that learning difference or disability, it is easier almost to kind of get those accommodations in college because of the difference in the bodies recognizing that. Is that correct?
Well, again, it's like there's no blanket statement. What I'll say is, they're going to look carefully at the documentation. What they want, the reason why they want the documentation is they want a specific diagnosis, which isn't usually given in a 504 or an IEP. That's one thing. They want to know what the diagnosis is, how it affects learning, and what accommodations are needed. So even if the diagnosis is NVLD and that's not recognized in the DSM, there'll still be an explanation of how that affects the student's learning and why they need specific accommodations. So it's, again, it will depend from college to college, but it's going to depend a lot more on that. Like they want a reason why the student needs to have, these accommodations. So in a neuropsych, there'll be a lot of narrative about the tests that were given and the struggles that the student has. And even if, NVLD isn't officially recognized, all the rest of the information is right there. So I don't see how that would be a problem, to be honest. Yeah.
And then one last question, it's kind of specific on my end, and then I do have some more in the comments.
Mhm.
And this is just because when I went to college, it was a little bit different, but the foreign language requirement, and I don't know if you're asking this when you go, are colleges starting to accept programming and coding as foreign languages? I know that there were a couple a long time ago that did. Are you seeing more of that now? Because that might be like an easier foreign language to take. Is
I
there an
haven't,
easier foreign language?
I haven't seen that. The other thing that people ask, no, I have not seen that. I mean, and again, it's possible that it's somewhere out there.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think they want that spoken foreign language.
Okay.
Now, some colleges um, will have American Sign Language as a course, and that will be considered foreign language. But again, it will depend from college to college. Now, I also get families say, "Oh, my child didn't take foreign language in high school because they did have a waiver. Is that going to affect them getting into college?" I have not found that to be a problem. I mean, you may want to include a letter to the admissions officer saying, this is why there's no foreign language. It's part of my, IEP, and I've made up for it by taking these classes and whatever. What's more important than that, so I haven't seen that stop students from getting into college. What I think is more important is what's going to happen once they get to college. Will they have to take foreign language in college? Will they be allowed to have a substitution? Because again, if they're not, and if they've never taken foreign language because it's just too difficult for them, you got to think about what that's going to look like.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. So those were all of my questions and comments because I always have a lot.
Great.
So we're going to go back to our post from Facebook earlier today. So we had a question about child is in a community college right now, but wants to go to a 4-year college away in the fall. With less supports and parents no longer sitting there helping, how can we ensure success and support from the college? Which you've answered a lot of that today as far as like doing due diligence, making that call to make sure the accommodations are in place. Is there anything else that you would recommend to this parent to make sure that that transition, I guess at this point, is now from community college, so a little bit of that college atmosphere, but maybe still living at home? Anything else that you would do to recommend success for her? She wants to be a special education teacher. Yay.
There's a big shortage. I just read the
There's a
special
huge
education
shortage.
teachers, so that's wonderful. So a lot of it will depend on the specific support the student needs.
Okay.
Okay, so what the family has to do is really like sit down and be very realistic about, okay, this is what my child would need when they go away, or this is what I'm doing for my child now that I won't be able to do for them in college. Will they be able to get that support in college? If it's academic, there's usually a lot of support available on campus, but again, that bears some investigating. If it's more executive functioning, then you have to find out if there's any support for that on campus. Sometimes disability services will help students with organization, with executive functioning. It's not really their job, but they'll help. Some colleges will have academic coaches that can help with that. So again, it's going to take some investigating. And what I recommend parents do, and I just sent a parent an email about this today, is, pick up the phone and call disability services. That's the best place to start. And say, these are my child's challenges. This is what they need to be successful. Can you provide this for them? And go from there. I've worked with students who do need the kind of one-on-one support that a fee-based support program offers, but the problem is that a lot of students don't want to limit themselves to that relatively small number of schools that have that support. So the next best thing that I recommend is working virtually with an executive functioning coach. And there's a lot of those coaches out there these days. But again, the main thing is, okay, what's the support my child needs? Will they get that in college? And if the college doesn't provide it, what's the bridge to make sure that they can get that support?
Awesome. Going back over to the comments in this, have you found any gap programs that help students who are not ready to advocate for themselves or has ASD and is an extremely rigid thinker to help prepare them if they didn't get it in high school? So basically, are there any gap programs that you know of that might help with that transition?
That I specifically know of that I would recommend. I'm not familiar enough with them.
Okay.
Here's what I would say is, oh, sorry, somebody's printing something on my printer. Sorry about the noise. Um, there is an organization called the Gap Year Association, and I would start there. And you can search there for all kinds of gap year programs, and you can talk to gap year specialists. I just don't want to give out, information if I'm not absolutely sure of it. So I know that there are programs that are geared towards students with all kinds of challenges. So again, that Gap Year Association is a great place to start. They have a gap year fair every year. I know in New York, it's usually in January. I think it's past. And it's at different times in different cities, but there's a lot of information online. And I think a gap year can be an amazing opportunity for a student to do some, for some growth and sort of self-realization before college.
Awesome. We have a lot of questions on here. We
Right.
may not get to all of these today. We might have to come on and answer them. Um, kind of answered some of these a little bit, but there is a question, and this may be something that they would want to look into working with you further on, and that's something that we can kind of, if you want to email Sherri at the end, but there's a question about, do you have a list of colleges that provide significant support? And then the opposite of that of like colleges that don't. I feel like this is probably your wheelhouse, which is what you would want to talk to them specifically, learn more about them. Is that correct?
Yes. So I often get the question, where is the list of colleges that have the best support? There is no list of colleges. So, a lot of professionals like myself are aware of the colleges that have the level of support that a lot of students need or have these fee-based academic support programs. However, not all students, again, want to limit themselves to that number. Here's another thing that I will just tell you is there is a difference. I'm going to turn my printer off for the moment. There is a difference between a supportive college and a college that has the support your child needs. So sometimes parents will say to me, "Oh, I've heard this college is really supportive." I'm like, "Well, what does that mean?" Like all colleges are going to be supportive on some level. Well, I hear they're really supportive, but do they have the support your child needs? So again, if your child needs that, one-on-one help, and remember, we're not talking about everyday total hand holding, but somebody to check in with, a couple of times a week or whatever. And again, a lot of students with executive functioning need that. Um, you know, then you need a college that has that support. Or again, second best might be working with an executive functioning coach. But I do get parents who say, that's not really going to work for my kid. They need somebody there. So this is sometimes I do what I call, like in fact, one of my colleagues reached out to me. She said, "Is there a list of colleges that don't require foreign language for graduation?" And I'm like, well, normally what I do is I sort of reverse engineer it. So I put together a list of colleges that have everything else a student wants. And then I literally pick up the phone or I might email and say, "What's your policy on foreign language substitutions?" So it means that we have to do a little more work as parents in terms of, helping our child put together that list of colleges, and then picking up, calling disability services and saying, this is the support my child needs. Can you provide it? And I can do that. And I do that in a more general sense, but I always tell parents to do that because they know their child best. They know their child. I will never know their child the way that they do. I can help them figure out questions to ask. But again, they're going to know best what their child needs.
Yeah.
So again, there's no lists. You can work with a professional. You can do, or you can do a lot of the work on your own. You know what your child needs, and you just have to make that match with what the college offers.
Yep. And you literally just answered another question that was on here about clarifying who to call about the foreign language requirements. So you would recommend calling the disability office to confirm what the substitutions and the kind of the rules around that are, if
And
there are.
right. And what's easier in a lot of ways is just email them. They're real busy. So on their website, there's always an email address, and you just email them your question. And what I like about email is then you basically have, like a hard copy, so to speak, of what their response is in case something changes or like, this is what I was told by this person. Not
Awesome.
that I see that as a problem. It's just, I always like, having proof, so to speak.
You never know. Yeah.
You never know exactly.
You have a lot of gratitude in the comments as well. Thank you so much. This information is very helpful.
So happy to help. So happy.
Yeah, even like thinking back to my transition from college or from high school to college, I was like, oh, that would have been like really helpful to like frame it that way, to think of things in a certain way and do some of that. So I think this is super helpful. Like I said a little bit ago, I know Sherri popped it up earlier, but we will drop the website and her contact information into the comments in case anybody wants to reach out. If you have additional questions, want to contact Sherri about her services, and especially if you've got a student that's in that kind of prep time, it's time to start looking at colleges and consider what's next. Sure, she would be happy to help and take on some new students and parents to help you guys. If we do see any more comments, Sherri, I can put those together in an email and send those over to you. But if you're watching this, not while we are live and you're watching the recording, please do feel free to drop any other questions, comments into the chat box or comment section, whatever it is. And we'll be sure to get those answered because I know that there's a lot of questions around this subject. It's a very hot subject. We had quite a few people logged on tonight compared to other times. I'm guessing some of that's the time and some of it's the subject matter just being super helpful. So very much appreciate you taking the time to chat with us tonight. Those are very helpful tips. Excited to kind of see what conversations that sparks as well. Thank you all for joining us tonight. If you want to reach out to Sherri again, information will be in the comments, and we will have our next Facebook Live on the last Tuesday of February, which I believe is the 27th. So we will be back on a Facebook Live with another guest. And in the meantime, feel free to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, so you can see where we post all the articles and tips and all that kind of stuff that we find across the web to help students or adults with NVLD. So yeah, I think that's it for tonight. We are almost right at an hour. Sherri, do you have any last words for the night?
I feel like I got it all out, but good luck. Try to stay calm. Don't get caught up in the madness. And really that last slide I think sums it all up is, let's set our kids up for success.
Definitely.
Thank you all for coming. I as you can see, I love talking about this. I love helping families. So it's been a pleasure to be here.